This is The Right Approach. I'm JW Judge, and with me is my co-host Barbara Hensky. This is a podcast for writers to learn more about the craft and business of writing as we explore a new topic every week. Our guest today is Margaret Lucke, and I'm actually going to have Margaret introduce herself and what she does as a writing professional and help us jump into our conversation today about scene construction and having compelling scenes and how that works as a part of your writing craft as a whole. So Margaret, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, well, as you said, I'm Margaret Lucke. I write tales of love, ghosts, and murder, sometimes all three in one book. I have books out in a couple of burgeoning series. There's only a couple of books so far in each. One, this is the latest one in my paranormal series called House of Desire. It features Claire Scanlon, who is a real estate agent in Marin County, just north of San Francisco. And she has strange experiences when she walks into certain houses that nobody else has. And they often lead her to try to figure out what went wrong in that house and solve a crime there. I also have a series, this is the latest one of those, Snow Angel, which features Jess Randolph, who is a San Francisco artist and private investigator. This may surprise some of you out there, but it's not always easy to earn a living as an artist. So she's a PI as her day job, and she kind of thinks of both of those careers as ways to search for the truth. I also do a lot of developmental editing and other kinds of editing. I am the editor of the Sisters in Crime Northern California chapter's first anthology called Fault Lines. And it was a lot of fun to put that book together.
That sounds like a really appropriate title for California writers.
Yeah.
We thought so.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's a fault can be interpreted in many kinds of ways when you're writing about when you're writing crime fiction. But I also, in addition to that, have been teaching writing classes for many years. I teach primarily for the University of California at Berkeley's extension program. But I've also done workshops for individual writing organizations here, there, one-day workshops. And I'm about to launch a series of guides to various aspects of writing craft that are based on the lessons that I've been teaching for all of those years for UC Berkeley Extension. So that sort of sums up my writing day.
Well, I like that you cover you're doing the writing, but you're also coaching and speaking and helping other writers. And I think that gives you a really broad perspective, because I know there's a lot of editors who are really good editors, but aren't writers. And so there is that component of it that, that they are not necessarily in touch with. So I know that for me, when I'm writing, most of my chapters comprise one scene. Some that's not true, but I mean, probably 90% are one scene. And so I am, when I'm writing, focused on, that chapter, that scene, and making it as good as possible before moving on to the next one, because I know that each one has to be compelling in its own right. So when you're talking to authors and writers, what are the foundation blocks of a good scene that we need to be bearing in mind for every scene that we write in our books?
Okay. Most of mine, or a lot of mine, have one scene too. Some of them will have 2 or 3 scenes in them, depending on their length. Writing in scenes is the best way that I know to fulfill that writer's dictum that we often hear, that old saw, show, don't tell. Because if you're writing in a scene, you almost have to be showing rather than telling if it's a real scene. So what's a scene? To me, a scene is a unit of action. It is something specific that happens at one time, in one place, and in one point of view. And if you change any of those, you're changing a scene. Sometimes it's easy to slip into a new scene almost without noticing, but those are the foundational elements of a scene. Why one writes in scene, that show don't tell aspect of it. One of the things is you say, okay, you write a scene for a chapter. Perfect. You write the scene, you're done. You have a building block. You have something that has happened, and then you can move on. And it's really good for project planning. You've heard about, well, a project's a big thing, but an action step is doable. And writing a scene is an action step. You write enough of them, you take enough action steps, you write enough scenes, and eventually you have your book. So that's one of the reasons why it's good for writers. It makes for good project management. It's good for flexibility too, because you can rearrange scenes. You can write a scene when it inspires you. You may not know where it fits, but you know this is going to happen somewhere, and then you can rearrange them according to what needs to be done. One of the things I like about the writer software Scrivener, I don't know if either of you use it or are familiar with it, but a lot of writers do. And the main thing I use it for is the corkboard feature, where you have a little capsule, summary capsule of a scene on what looks like an index card, and you can rearrange them until they fall into the right order. I think readers these days expect scenes. They're cinematic, and we've become accustomed to consuming our entertainment in that form. So this is another reason why it's a powerful thing to do. Television, movies, they're all done in scenes. So readers are accustomed to, receiving their entertainment in scenes, and they like it that way. Because you can make them dynamic, you can make them vivid, and you can make them engaging.
So I want to go back to something you said a minute ago, because I don't think it's ever occurred to me, and maybe it should have, maybe this is a blind spot, that you could write in something other than scenes. But the way you said that it's, the best way to write makes me think that that's possible. Maybe that's something I should have thought about before. Are there means? Well, I guess now that I think about it, if you're writing something epistolary, it may not be in a scene format or something like that. So what are other alternatives to writing in a scene? And I also want you to go back to and describe a little bit how writing in a scene necessarily helps you show and not tell.
Okay. I'm not sure what the name for it would be. I think of it as narrative, but in a way, anything you're writing that is storytelling is narrative. But as an example, you can just explain to readers what's happening. Little Red Riding Hood walks through the woods and carries her basket. She's going to go to her grandmother's house and give her grandmother the goodies and check on her welfare. That's not really setting up a scene. You're telling somebody what happened or what's about to happen. On the other hand, if Little Red Riding Hood skipped down the pebbled path up to her grandmother's front door. She set down her basket and knocked on the door and waited for a response from within. "Come in," came a voice from within. That was odd. That didn't sound like Granny's voice. It sounded deeper somehow. Was everything all right? She turns the knob and peeks in. Everything seems to be okay. So she tiptoes in back to her grandmother's room. You're in the scene with her. The difference between a scene and a non-scene, the biggest difference to me, is that in the scene, you are giving your reader an opportunity to experience what's going on along with the characters, as opposed to simply explaining to them what's happening in the story. Sometimes narrative is useful. Sometimes you want to cover a lot of ground.
Yeah.
In one thing, over the next 4 years, Scarlett O'Hara went to high school, before she, moved on to become the belle of the ball. You may have to explain a few things that way for transitional purposes, or once in a while backstory purposes, although often you can work backstory into a scene also. But that's how I see the difference. Is the scene is your opportunity as a writer to provide an experience to your reader, to bring them into your story and let them live it and experience it along with the characters. For me as a reader, that's much the way I prefer to have a story. It's the way I prefer to read.
Our conversation reminds me of an interview we did. I think it was, Jeremy, correct me if I'm wrong, it was David Ellis who writes with James Patterson. And Patterson is the poster child for the scene. He wants everything to be scenes, and scenes are 1,200, maybe 1,500, but no more words. And so Jeremy and I have both kind of gotten on that bandwagon, and I think it really helps pacing. What do you recommend? Do you try and coach your clients to keep those scenes short, or what do you do?
I think the scene is as long as it needs to be. I don't try to keep them to a particular length when I'm writing my own work. I probably, although that's not a bad, certainly I have scenes that are that short. I probably have scenes that are quite a bit longer. You definitely don't want a scene that would be longer than, say, a good short story, and often good short stories are several scenes. So that's not a bad recommendation, but I don't necessarily think you want to put numbers on it.
Okay. And it sounds to me like you're a plotter, not a pantser. Do you want to address that?
I have, the answer is yes and no.
Okay.
My instincts are as a plotter, I think, but what I have found is that every book I've written has had its own demands.
Yeah.
When I wrote House of Desire, the one, the paranormal that I showed you the cover of, it absolutely refused to be plotted. And when I got to the end of the first draft and realized that it was almost 140,000 words, I had a major cutting exercise to go through. And I took out an entire subplot, and even that wasn't enough. And I pared it down to a reasonable novel length. I have written a book. One time I was, the previous book in that series, the editor that was going to be publishing it wanted a synopsis. She had bought it basically sight unseen. We talked about the story, and she said, fine, good, we want that. Send me a synopsis. And I discovered that the only way I could write a synopsis of an unwritten book was to plot it out scene by scene so that I knew what happened, and then I could boil that down. So that one was fully outlined, and was easy to write. I wasn't expecting this, but it ended up not deviating from the outline at all. When I've written the books in the other series, I've done kind of what I think of as a 3-part outline. I basically do kind of outline Act 1 and get impatient to start writing. So I will write Act 1, and as I am getting to near the end of that, I realize I'm getting nervous. I don't know what happens next, and I try to figure out what happens in at least part of Act 2, and then I can write that. And then when I realize, wait, I don't know what's happening next, I don't know what I'm building up to, then I will outline some more. So I do it in stages. And that, for me, tends to work really well.
Wait a minute here. You write mysteries,
Yes.
right? So do you ever paint yourself into the proverbial corner, or don't you
Oh,
kind of
of
have to
course.
know who done it? Yeah. Are you ever
But
surprised at who, when you get done, that's like, oh, they're the one who did it? I didn't think they were the, I mean, is this discovery
well,
for
I'm writing a book now, and I don't know who did it, and I'm finding that that's a little bit problematic, because I don't know what I'm setting up exactly. So
yeah.
yes, every book has its own demands, I discover. For writing a mystery, what I like to do is figure out the basics of what I think of as the hidden story. Every mystery or crime novel, and actually a lot of other kinds of novels too, but certainly in that genre, what you're telling really is two stories. And there's the story of the who did what to whom and why. And that's what I think of as the hidden story. You're not telling that one directly, but what I think of is the surface story, which is the one that you're actually writing and the one that the reader is going to be reading, is about how your main character goes about figuring out what's in the hidden story.
Mhm.
And that becomes slowly revealed over the course of the story. And I do find that most of the time, and as I said, I have not fully done this for the current book, but figuring out the basics of the hidden story is a good idea before you start writing. At least have some idea of it. Now that can change. I
Mhm.
got advice early on when I was writing my first novel from Marcia Muller, who went on to be awarded a Grand Master by the Mystery Writers of America. Um, and her advice was to figure out early on who might be the alternative villain, so that if it works out that your original villain has an unbreakable alibi or turns out not to have done it, you've got somebody else in line. And when I heard that, I realized, I said, okay, I'm writing my first mystery here. I'll figure out who my alternative villain might be. This gives you some, an extra suspect. It gives you somebody, it gives you red herrings. And I realized that my original villain wasn't as good a candidate as my backup villain was. So I kind of switched their places. I set it up to look like my original villain might have done it, but my backup villain turned out to be the real culprit. And for motivation and other reasons, I think that worked a lot better.
Barb, I know you were surprised by what she was saying, but when I wrote my fifth novel, Watch Party, I was at least halfway through it before I knew or decided who did it. And in the book that I'm 25,000 words into now,
Right.
part of it involves a murder, and I don't know who did it. So it's really, and Margaret, the way that you described your three-part process there of sorting out what's going on is not dissimilar from what I've done for my last couple of books. And it's different from what I did for the first few books. I don't know which one's better. Each one, like you said, seems to have its own demands and requires its own path. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, particularly when I was early on in attempting to write a novel, and I've talked on here before about how I have two that are still unfinished. What I had difficulty with was figuring out how to knit scenes together, to move from point A to point B to point C, because a lot of times I had these scenes and they felt disparate, and like they didn't attach to each other, and there were times where I had to just get uncomfortable that we can go from A to B and we can just be in a different place all of a sudden, and that's okay because it's a new chapter and that's fine. But there were times I just didn't know how to connect those things together. Do you have advice for, you know, I was going to say young writers, but not always young, inexperienced writers who are trying to sort out that part of the craft?
Well, one of the things that you always want to do when you're writing a scene is give the reader's reason to go on to the next scene. And you may not do with it in the immediately preceding scene. It could be 2 or 3 or 4 scenes earlier. But this is where foreshadowing comes in, and planting a clue. And I don't mean planting a clue in the sense of a murder mystery clue, but just kind of a clue as to what's going to happen down the road. You know, if you have one of the characters comment to the other that, you know, well, we'll have to go up to the mountain cabin and see what's going on there. You know, when you get to the scene to the mountain cabin, the reader's not going to be surprised. They're going to be waiting for it and eager to get there. So I think it's not hard to kind of give these little hints in the course of earlier scenes as to what might happen in the later scenes. Not always the very next scene, but sometimes you'll say, oh, well, we need to go down to the coffee shop and talk to so-and-so, and the next scene's in the coffee shop. You know, this is not a surprise. But I think that you can build that momentum and roll it forward by just giving these little hints. You always want to end a scene in a way that the reader's going to want to go on and figure out what happens next.
And Barb, I'm interested in your approach to this too, because one of the things that when I was learning to write a novel, one of the things that I would do is when I got stuck and I had point A and I knew what point D was, but I didn't know what the 2 intermediate steps were. I would just sit down and literally write, okay, you know, A has ended. What is the next thing to happen? Like, even if it's some mundane thing, what is the next thing to happen? And that would get me to writing myself into, you know, a direction that goes where I need it to go. And a lot of times that next thing would get cut because it wasn't essential. It wasn't necessary to the storytelling, but it served its purpose for me as the writer to get me into, you know, where I needed to go. So Barb, what are your thoughts here?
I tend to write I write chronologically, scene to scene to scene. And I tend to keep my time frames pretty compact versus these sweeping things. So usually I get, well, we can ask them that at the coffee shop, and then the next scene is coffee shop. So there isn't a whole lot, but sometimes I do need to skip. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. The reader's wondering where in the heck we are because I've been building momentum that way. So then I have to put in something a little more artful than, you know, a week later or at the end of the week or 2 days later. I've seen writers do chapters where they've got multiple point of view characters and they will just don't have a chapter title, but they'll say John or Mary or whatever. So at least we know, okay, where are we now? I used to think that was kind of an inartful way to do it, but as a reader, I just appreciate that. It makes it easy for me, and what's wrong with being easy? But once in a while I do write a scene that I know isn't going to make it, but I just need to put my characters on stage yapping at each other about something. So I kind of figure that's the way I just think through what's going to happen next. It's maddening to cut those words. And I can't imagine, Margaret, when you cut a whole subplot out of that series, have you saved that so it'll appear in a future book?
Oh, absolutely. I save just about everything because you never know when it's going to come in handy. I don't know when it's going to appear, but I kind of like the subplot. So
yeah,
I do think that the book that I took it out of is a stronger book for all the cutting.
Yeah.
And it really didn't need that particular subplot in order to be interesting. There was enough going on without it. But definitely there were some characters there that I won't say like exactly because they aren't entirely likable, but are worth bringing back in a future book. And I'm sure it'll come back.
I
And
think this is an interesting point to think about, is that writer you found it necessary as you're writing the book to write that part of it. And editor you came back and said, you know what, this book is stronger without this component, and took it out. Do you edit as you write? Do you do all the editing later, or how do you approach that? Because I know that sometimes there's all manner of approaches to it, but I know that some folks, when they try to edit while writing, can get them all out of sorts. So what does that look like for you?
well, there's a certain amount of editing that I do as I go along. You know, I've done enough editing and fine tuning kinds of editing that it bugs me to see a comma out of place. So at that level, you know, I try to make the scene work as I'm writing the scene. How the scenes get strung together often is what changes. I belong to a writer's critique group, and I like to make sure that I'm not totally embarrassing myself when I give them something to read. But yes, I put my work through multiple drafts later. You know, when I knit the whole thing together and finally that last book that the one that I took the subplot out of was the one that refused to outline, and therefore I didn't know where I was going a lot of the time. So it wasn't a total surprise that some of the things turned out to be extraneous. If it had actually permitted me to outline it ahead of time, I probably would have done a much better job. But I had went through, for instance, part of for a long time in the book, I thought that a particular character was in love with a certain other character, and discovered by the end that no, that was not true, that it was somebody else was the object of his affections, and I had to rewrite quite a bit because of that. So, you know, books will surprise you.
Can I ask what editing software, if any, do you use as part of your process?
I don't really.
Okay, wow.
I've been doing editing a long time, so most of it's
Yeah.
in my brain.
Okay, excellent.
And Barb, I know that you and I have probably talked about this before, but I think it's been a while. What editing software do you prefer?
I like, I've used Grammarly. I prefer Pro Writing Aid, and I just on Black Friday bought AutoCrit, which I've decided, which is kind of, I think, a mashup between Pro Writing Aid. In fact, I think they incorporate Pro Writing Aid into AutoCrit. It's kind of a mashup between that, Plotter, and Scrivener. So I'm going to force myself to write my next project, which will be a novella, in AutoCrit. I bought it because I wanted to have software that would gather a series Bible for me, create a series Bible. Plotter has that function, is supposed to do it. I just don't like it very well. So, you know, it was on sale. I followed the rabbit hole down the new shiny, and we'll see. I'm going to, you know, how that is. There's always a million new things, but I'm going to give it a try. What do you use, Jeremy?
I use Pro Writing Aid and have used it for several years now. But I only use it at the end, really, unless I get hung up and decide to do some editing in the middle to just kind of find my way, which I will occasionally do. And then I will use it for that. But it's not something like I can run it contemporaneously as I write in Scrivener and just have it turned on, but it distracts me with the
Yes.
squiggly lines and the different colors and that sort of thing. So I keep it turned off until I'm actually ready to implement it. But I have heard a lot of good things about AutoCrit. So that's interesting. Before we go, Margaret, please tell us where to find you and the work that you do, because I know that you do a lot of speaking and things like that, and people may want to register for courses that you're doing or things like that, or find you where they can do that. So if you'll let us know here.
Okay. I'm at margaretlucke.com, just my name. .com is the easiest way to find me. I would like to invite anybody who's interested to sign up for my newsletter, which has the occasional writing tips and, puzzles and fun stuff and some news. I have a tip sheet that I've put together that includes the 7 elements of a powerful scene. And anyone who's watches this and would like to just contact me through the website and say, send me your tip sheet on scenes, I would be happy to do that.
Perfect.
I love to hear from readers.
Perfect.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge and expertise. I know that Barbara and I will certainly benefit from it, as will all the folks who tune in here.
Yep.
All right. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.